I'd like to welcome you to the 23rd Annual Energy Fair. Yes! Still going. My name is Nick Hyla. I'm the director of the MREA, and it is my pleasure to announce the scholarship recipients for the Steve Hansen scholarships. Steve Hansen was a brilliant educator. We have a scholarship fund to give young adults who are pursuing careers in renewable energy and sustainability scholarships to go to school. And so this year we're awarding 3 scholarships. So I think we'll do the best one first, and the best one is the one that's here today to talk with you. And her name is Leah Janes. She goes to school at Kickapoo High School and lives in Lafarge. And she is pursuing a pre-engineering degree at Northland College. And she'd like to say a few words. Raise your hand if you've been to Northland College. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody. As you said, I'm Leah. First of all, I want to say thank you. It's a great privilege to be up here speaking and saying thanks for receiving this scholarship. It really is an honor. And like you said, I'm going to be doing engineering, and I want to do environmental engineering, and I'm starting at Northland because they have a free engineering program. And what I want to do with the engineering is possibly work with the government, work with policy change, and maybe work with alternatives to plastics. So kind of get into that area. All right, with that, just want to say thank you again. So.
Careful. Okay, I lied. We have another one here. We won't call her second best because she's there also. And her name is Kira Meinhardt. She brought her family and friends, I see. And she's from Wapaka, so really close to here. And she's pursuing a degree at Stanford. And she'd like to say a few words. So big round of applause.
Thank the MREA. It's a really awesome thing that happens in central Wisconsin, and all the sponsors, especially Conserve School. They have a booth and a lot of students here representing, so check out the booth if you haven't yet. And Conserve really inspired me to do a lot of the things that I am now pursuing, and it's a great place, and thank you all.
And our last recipient couldn't be here, but her name is Alex Kermis, and she's from Minnesota, and she's pursuing a degree at University of Florida, sustainability degree. And that's 3 scholarships. If you'd like to support young people pursuing education in renewable energy and sustainability, give to the Hansen Scholarship, and I can be up here next year doing the same thing. So I would like to introduce a person that really has made this fair happen since before I've been here, and he is a man that has more energy than anyone else I know, and he'll be introducing our keynote, and many of you know him, so please welcome Mark Morgan. He's on our board of directors.
Welcome. You enjoying the fair? Back in '89-90, I got to go to, I think it was called the Seeds of Peace, Waters of Justice Conference in Milwaukee. And that's the first time I got to hear Frances speak. And she also did a workshop there. So I bought her book, Diet for a Small Planet, back then, still have it on the shelf, and really enjoy it. Little to say about her. So much. 18 books. 18 honorary degrees, fantastic work all the time that she does. She has her new book out up here at the end. Welcome her, Frances Moore Lappé.
I have to say, there's magic here. I I flew in from Boston exhausted and kind of a little bit down in the, spirits. And I got up this morning, met Ellie and all these people, and heard the backstory of this wonderful event, and my spirits are soaring out of the tent. So, thank you. Thank you. So, of course, I'm grateful to this enormously impressive track record of the MREA and the Energy Fair itself. I wanted to thank, as I have, Ellie Jackson, who's just been so kind to me, and Mark Morgan, and Nick Nyla. Hyla. Got it. Okay. So, before I start, I want to mention a couple of things that I know I always forget. You will be receiving, I hope, 2 clipboards, and one is the quarterly e-letter that my daughter, Moore Lappé, who I'm honored to work with, and I, we put out occasionally, once a quarter. The other, we can talk about in the Q&A, but it is my challenge with 6 other scholars to Oxford University Press that has said in writing to us that books for classroom use no longer need to have citations, and that they are willing to publish a book by an author who has been an advisor to a Monsanto company without disclosing to readers that this is the fact. So I've delivered 5,000 signatures already to Oxford. I'm keeping going, and I really need your support on this. I think this is foundational to every value that we share. So I'd appreciate your signatures. Thank you. So I like to begin with a mantra that kind of strangely comes from D. Hock, founder of Visa, but he said it, it's far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism. Yes. So that's what I work on a daily basis, and as I said, you're helping me greatly in that, living that truth. So, okay, I start out, of course, I have to accept the bad news that we just heard a few years ago from MIT scientists, that global heating is going to be twice as bad as we thought it was just a few years ago. I recognize that in the next 24 hours, 100 or so species will be lost forever. I recognize that now, despite an increase per capita in food production since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, we have record number of hungry people in the world. All of that. So the question I've been asking for now almost 7 decades, well, no, that's not true. I didn't start asking this at birth. But for the last 4 decades, since Diet for a Small Planet, is why? Why? Is it that we don't know the solutions? Well, I don't think so. I mean, you know the solutions in regard to energy, and you've seen the studies such as that produced, that was a partly Pentagon-funded study, actually, by Rocky Mountain Institute that said that we could be completely off oil in a few decades at the cost of 1/5 of what we had been spending on the war in Iraq. We know that the Union of Concerned Scientists tells us that in a few decades, the energy savings, if we move to renewables, per household would be about $900 a year. So we know the solutions. We know that in terms of food, there's so many studies now, but there's one meta-study that's really important, came out in 2007 from the University of Michigan, that told us if the entire world moved in the direction of organic agriculture, that we could actually increase food production by as much as 50% worldwide. So we know the solutions. What about poverty? Well, in this country, in my generation, the 60s, when I was a community organizer, we cut the poverty rate in half in 1 decade of the 1960s. So whether it's energy or food or poverty, we know the solutions are there. So if the solutions are known, what could be powerful enough to keep this really bright species creating a world together that none of us as individuals would ever choose? Because no one gets up in the morning, even the most callous person, and says, I want another child to die of hunger, or I want the planet to heat and destroy species. So that became my overriding question by about the 1990s. And I was helped by many great teachers to this realization that you start by looking at what's different about us, about our species. Well, one of the unique things about us is that we see the world through a filter. Erich Fromm, the philosopher, called it frame of orientation. My daughter and I call it simply our mental map. It's just who we are. We can't see what's not in our mental map, but we're not expecting to see. We have a very hard time seeing. So there's nothing particularly wrong with it. Let me just give you a homey example of how powerful the mental map is, our expectations. It's Thanksgiving in my house, and I have to get up and make a dish that I love, a root vegetable dish, for 33 people coming in the afternoon. And I rush to my Dutch oven where I'm sure it is on the shelf, and it's not there. So I look in another cupboard, it's not there. So I look in the basement, it's not there, and I get really upset. I must have lent it to somebody and they forgot. I didn't forget, they forgot, right? So I go ahead doing something else, and soon I turn around, and there is my Dutch oven, a few feet away. Only I had put a plant in it. Right? So I was looking for what? A kitchen item, something to bake in. But I had made it into a planter, so of course it was in the wrong category. It's red, and it's big, and I still couldn't see it. So this is the power of our mental map. Now, that's just who we are, and it's all okay if we're alive, absorbing. It's kind of like an invisible ether we absorb in our culture, now going global. If that mental map serves life, if it's fundamentally aligned with our nature, with human nature, it's fine. But, and here's the thesis of my heart song, if you will, that I sing now, is that you and I are alive in this moment where the dominant mental map, the one now going global, is fundamentally perversely aligned with our own nature and with wider nature. And that's really what I want to talk about before I get into the sense of possibility that is emerging in the new mental map. But the dominant mental map that I grew up and still see over and over, just yesterday in the Portage something Gazette, same thing, scarcity. Scarcity, there's not enough. It's a worldview that assumes what I call a lack of goods and goodness. There's not enough energy, there's not enough food. In Boston, there's certainly never enough parking places. And there's not enough goodness in us. So it's a double whammy. There's not enough stuff in the world for us, and there's not enough goodness in our hearts. What does that mean? It means that we're set up to feel that we're trapped in this competitive struggle for kind of, the crumbs, basically, for fighting over too little, and we better get ours, and it's really scary. So at the very foundation of the mental map that we absorb is fear. That is my thesis. So this thesis then, I'm claiming, one based on the fear of being without, is one that ultimately makes us powerless, feel powerless. It makes our own power invisible to us. How? How does it do that? Well, first by saying there's not enough, but more importantly by telling us that we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust ourselves to be able to come together and get excited about a common good for the whole. No, we're too selfish, materialistic for that. So, better that we just find some infallible law that works on its own, that self-corrects without us, and then we turn over outcomes to that. You see where I'm heading? Well, Ronald Reagan even named it for us. It is the magic of the market. So, what we fail when we get into the magical thinking, we fail to note that actually we had an object lesson in the kind of market that we are now living. Most of us, 1 billion of us around the world, have played the game. It's called Monopoly. And in my household, at the end of the night, my brother had all the property. Which wasn't so bad, I thought, because I could go to sleep at least and get a good night's sleep. Then, as an adult, I realized, oh my gosh, we're playing a giant game of Monopoly where at the end of the night, I'd be out on the street, not in my bed cozy. So the world that we've created is this distrust of self, belief that we have to hand over our fate to this infallible law that is actually based on one rule: highest return to existing wealth. So wealth accrues to wealth accrues to wealth until not Francis Moore Lappé, but the researchers at Citigroup in 2005 wrote a memo, which was on the web, now off the web, wrote a memo that said, we are now a plutonomy. The top 1% controlling as much as the bottom 90% put together. So there we are. We end up, from this fear of scarcity, then creating the experience of scarcity. As now you saw the papers a few days ago, those 3 years at the height of from the beginning to the height of the current recession, the median American household lost 40% of its wealth. So we end up creating the experience of scarcity amid plenty. So this is this worldview premised in lack. And the reason that it is so deadly is not that simply that it concentrates wealth, creating the experience of scarcity. Half of our children in the US will at some point be on food stamps now in their lives, despite the fact that we are the world's preeminent food exporter. So it creates the experience of scarcity, but as we now see, it infuses and infects our political system so that we end up not with the democracy that we grow up being taught about, but with what I've come to call privately held government. I think that's the best description. And so we end up actually then creating rules that reinforce that cycle of concentrated power. So that is one way that this premise of lack ends up creating a feeling of powerlessness, because we give over our power to a force that concentrates power. So what am I really saying? This is really what I want to leave you with, that our crisis is not ecological ignorance or human greed. It is that the way we've been taught to see the world, is perversely aligned with human nature and with the laws of nature. And that's what I'm going to talk about for just a moment. So what do I mean?
Please proceed to your vehicle. Please proceed to your vehicle. Thank you.
Okay. So, what do I mean by perversely aligned with our nature? Well, first, this is really the foundation. That human beings, we know we are complex creatures. We know we are complex creatures. We know that not a few of us, but most of us, in certain conditions, will behave with incredible callous neglect. Just think today, 1/3 of world deaths, I just read on the plane, a Yale professor calculated that 1/3 of annual deaths today is from the effects of poverty. And yet, where is the global uprising? So we know that under certain conditions, we can be very neglectful in face of outrage. We know, too, that in certain conditions, we can actually, not a few of us, but most of us, behave with incredible brutality. If you think of how many of you have ever heard of the Stanford prison experiment? Some of you have. Well, basically, normally tested young people were put into a mock prison setting in 1971 in Stanford, near where I was writing Diet for a Small Planet. And they had to stop the experiment within a few days because the guards were so brutally terrorizing the prisoners that later the professor who organized the experiment said it looked like Abu Ghraib. And these were normal kids. So whether it be when we are the guinea pigs in an experiment like that, or whether it is the history of the Holocaust, which wasn't, by the way, just a few madmen, but millions of people participating in one way or another, we have to face, and we're ready to face, I think, as a species, that under certain conditions, not a few, but most of us will behave very badly. And until we're tested, we don't know where we are on that register. So that's clear. But we also know that we are equally what I call soft-wired, just as we are soft-wired under certain conditions to behave with incredible cruelty. We're also soft-wired through eons of evolutionary time to have incredibly strong pro-social qualities. Why? Because 95% of our evolution was in tightly knit tribes. And if you read a brilliant anthropologist, Sarah Blaffer Hardy, she will explain how we are the only species that cooperate so much in the rearing of our children and how this allowed us to develop these big brains. But it's that trust that is unique, that depth of trust, unique in our species. So we evolved, and I'm going to come back to this in just a moment, but we involved very, very powerful positive qualities. So, it seems to me that we are soft-wired both for these deeply positive, whether it be cooperation, empathy, fairness. I'm going to give you some exciting examples of research on this in a moment. So the good news is not that we have these qualities. The really good news is that now in the 21st century, we have enough history and enough science to know what are the conditions that bring out the worst in us and what are the conditions that bring forth the best in us. Because we, with an eco-mind, title of my book, the eco-mind, we can see that we're like any organism in nature. So much depends on what is the context. You know, metaphorically, are we watered? Do we get the right nutrients? Well, the social context and what does it bring out in our species. And so I think that we can be pretty clear that three conditions, I'm going to hazard, three conditions over our history have been shown to almost certainly bring out the worst in us. They are the concentration of power, whether political or economic. They are culture of secrecy, anonymity, as we saw on Wall Street, where the slogan was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. That meant that they knew they'd be out of there with their millions before anybody knew what happened. So we don't do well with secrecy. And third are cultures of blame, where we're saying, oh no, it's the Wall Street crooks, rather than where were we when the whole standards broke down and deregulation happened? What is our responsibility too in that? So I would say there are three conditions then: the concentration of power, secrecy, and a culture of blame. Under those conditions, most of us do pretty badly. So you know what? I believe that part of the extraordinary thing about being alive in this moment is that we, for the first time, can really get a clear-headed look at this. And we can actually then say, okay, we know what brings out the worst of us, and therefore we know what to do. We can flip these conditions that bring out the negative, and we can be pretty sure that most of us will behave in a more cooperative and problem-solving way together. And that gives us tremendous guidance. And then we start to see the power that we all have, the power that we all have to create continuous dispersion of power, the first condition. So we continuous dispersion of power, which, by the way, isn't just about what somebody else does, it's the kind of power that you are creating. That is helping to disperse power by the very ingenuity, creativity, and hard work that you're engaged in. So, number one, in terms of transparency, demanding, as in my own feeble way, this Oxford University Press petition, it's about transparency. We can call on that in every aspect of our lives, give the evidence for everything that we are doing, and being willing to be in constant dialogue about the iteration of knowledge. And we can also, the third condition, stop scapegoating anyone and recognize that if we're all connected through an ecological worldview, then we're all implicated and we all have power to make change, therefore. So that's the kind of beginning of solutions to what I see emerging, is the ecological worldview that is displacing this worldview based on the three S's, I call them, of separateness, stasis, things are fixed, and scarcity, worst of all. And we're moving into what I think of as the three C's of seeing the world that, of course, ecological sciences and our own experience tell us that we're always connected to one another. In nature, there is nothing static. Everything is a continuous change. And the reality is not scarcity, but possibility, because we are co-creating moment to moment. So this is really the idea of how we begin to move forward. And in this, I love to quote my friend, the German physicist, who said to me, Frankie, in this ecological worldview, there are no parts, there are only participants. And that's what we all then are. So If my theme today is the power of the big ideas that we're putting out there to each other, to the world, to increase people who are letting go of that fear of assuming power themselves and challenging non-transparent concentration of power, if that's what we're about, then how do we work on what are the big messages that we are rallying people about? And so the rest of my talk is organized around 5 of them. And I hope that I challenge you in this, I'll speak of first one, what I call a disempowering message or a thought trap in eco-mind. And that is, I often hear people say, we've hit the limits of a finite planet, and we've got to power down and learn to live within these limits. We've hit the limits of a finite Earth. And so, for example, in the Green Economics textbook by Herman Daly and Professors Daly and Joshua Farley, they write that fossil fuels freed us from the fixed flow of energy from the sun. And so I'm concerned that people hearing this framing, this idea, would feel very deflated and disempowered. The idea that would increase the fear of lack. And we know now from psychologists telling us that when people feel insecure, they become more materialistic and more concerned about their own mortality and more defensive. So I want to remind us, and I guess I don't have to remind this group, but I love to say it, the late wonderful leader in Germany, Hermann Scheer, reminded us that the Earth supplies us 15,000 times a daily dose of energy that we're currently using in fossil fuel. So we've got to drop this notion that we have to rely on the fixed energy of the sun. Actually, for all practical purposes, it is not renewable. It is just renewing. It is there for us, and its waste is perhaps the greatest waste of all. And we also hear people, when we hear this idea that fossil fuels freed us in some way from the fixed energy, that we forget that fossil fuels have entrapped us, have enslaved us. The last time I looked, Exxon, for example, was making $1,400 a second. And the concentration of power that represents, you know how that plays out in terms of the capacities to influence our privately held governments, so that fossil fuel is where the subsidies go. It's something like tenfold what is there available for renewables. So I think that it could be that instead of the notion that we hit the limits, that actually what people will experience looking back on this era is that we found our freedom from the entrapment that fossil fuels represent. And that, so I know the transition movement, which I love, talks about energy descent. I think maybe the better phrase would be energy freedom in that sense. So that takes me then to a closely aligned message. And that message that I often hear is that growth is the problem, and we have to slow or go toward no growth. And here is my challenge to that, and I think it's so critically important that we recognize what we're calling growth. We are blessing what we're currently doing with a positive word. I want my granddaughters to grow, right? It's a positive word. Yet, our current one-rule economy generates more waste and destruction than it does real growth. Think about this. It's estimated that 57% of all energy in the US is wasted. I've also seen credible studies showing that in power plants worldwide, on average, 2/3 of potential energy is wasted. I think of Amory Lovin's work about automobiles. 87% of the energy that could be moving us to place is wasted. And I then think about food. We now are feeding, think about this, we start out in grain. Grain alone can supply 3,500 calories, around that, per person per day, or I should say over 3,000, we're still working out conservatively, over 3,000 calories per person per day. And yet, at least 1/3 of that goes to livestock, and now increasingly to corn in the US, 40% going to fuel. 1/3 of all the food worldwide is wasted. A lot of it is wasted because people are simply too poor to buy it, too poor to store it. Did you see that big picture on the front page of the New York Times last week with hillocks of rotting grain in India, where over 40% of the children are stunted by malnutrition, but they can't afford that grain, so it's rotting away. So my point here about the growth message is that we've got to make very clear what we have now is an economy of waste and destruction, and what we want is thriving, regenerative economies like you are working on. And I think by changing that language, we can free people from fear and help people to recognize how much waste is built into our current economy. You know that, I don't have the exact quote on this, but even Thomas Edison once said, I quoted in EcoMind, once said that I'd put my money on solar, basically. So he knew how wasteful that incandescent bulb was that gets us, 5% of what the potential is. So let's call it what it is. And then we can move to create new rules and human relationships that actually ask, what is the connection between production and people eating? What is, the connection between food and the health of the soil and the health of our bodies? Those sorts of questions. But as soon as I get to this kind of notion about how we can be freed from the fear and actually see our economy operating the way it is with this built-in waste and destruction, then I run up against the thought trap that, but we can't do this because people are too selfish. People are not up to it. We have to change human nature. And that's really daunting. I know that one of my heroes, E.O. Wilson, says that we have to get beyond our Stone Age emotions. And I quote a British writer who says that we evolved in a way of life that was acquisitive, that was territorial, that was combative. And we evolved over eons of time, and now we only have a few thousand years to turn it. That's not very optimistic that we're going to change human nature. And so here I want to underscore, there has been a revolution in understanding human nature in the last few decades. And I've seen that term used by social psychologists in particular. But for one, we are realizing that, and the anthropologists tell us that we evolved as food sharers. Remember before I mentioned how we evolved in these tightly knit tribes? Well, they're now, when they look at our brains with the functional MRI scans, and they're finding that when human beings cooperate instead of compete, that it's so pleasurable, it's like eating chocolate. Yes. So, I don't think cooperatives, whether it be an official cooperative or the spirit of cooperation, we need to be on the defensive, that it's soft-wired in our evolutionary process. The other thing is that in this cooperative nature, a study done where they gave a group of people a bunch of money, and two groups of people a bunch of money. They told one group to spend it on themselves. They told the other group to buy a gift with it. And guess who was happier at the end of the day? It was the people who bought a gift. So that's another way of looking at what makes us happy. Another thing I love is to emphasize how soft-wired we are for empathy. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but we have what are called mirror neurons in our brains, which fire so that when I'm doing this, there are actually neurons in your brain that are doing that too. So we can literally kind of walk in each other's shoes, so that babies cry the sound of other babies crying, and even other species, it turns out. The rhesus monkey, in one study, there was a rhesus monkey who would go for up to 12 days without food, if in order to get that food he had to shock electric shock another monkey. So this is deep, deep, deep stuff. Equally important is fairness or justice. Because we understood, evolving in these tribal states, that injustice would break down the cohesion of the group, we were very attentive to creating rules that were fair and enforcing those rules. And so the philosopher Adam Smith, the one who supposedly is the godfather of greed, no. He said, we evolved, he said, we are in some peculiar way tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice. It is very deep. Equally important, we would not have made it to 7 billion if we were couch potatoes, whiners, and clueless. Right? We are doers. We're problem solvers. And so I love the work of Eric Fromm, who I relied on for helping me understand the mental map, but he put it this way: we've got to rewrite Descartes. It's not I think, therefore I am. It should be I am because I affect. That's how much we need. We need to know that we count. So boil down then, the human needs that are in us are the need for connection, for meaning, and for efficacy or power. And so that is really then a big help in understanding why I can say that our setup, our economic and political setup, is perversely aligned with our nature. And why depression, listen to this figure, depression in 8 years will be the second greatest burden, health burden in the world. Depression. It is now, let me get this right, it is now the leading cause of disability in the world, depression. There are 50% more suicides than homicides in the world. This tells us something, that these deep needs of ours are not being realized. And that's why I'm so excited to be with you. Because in some way, what you are creating here is meeting each of those needs. You're enabling people to find that in themselves and to believe in it. So okay, let me just move on to the fourth and fifth rules here. Messages. And when we get to that point about human beings are, soft-wired to be this way, then I can hear the kind of, okay, if we're so great, then why are we in this mess? Well, obviously, it's because we have to create the conditions, the rules, the standards to bring it out. As soon as I say that, I hear the American voice saying, people hate rules. What are you talking about? We're trying to get rid of all those rules. Rules stunt our freedom. America's about freedom. Yes. Well, here's my response, is that actually, little kids, we say, they like rules. We don't, right? We adults. Actually, all of us thrive. We couldn't get from one point to another if there weren't rules of the road. Every game, bed making, you name it, we all like to have the structure, the sense of expectation that we can count on, whether it's the 10 Commandments or marriage commitments. It's rules are what give meaning, structure, but also a sense of connectedness, because we know others are aware of those same rules, and therefore we're part of a community together. So rather than sort of just genetically averse to rules, I suggest that actually we are naturally prone to love them if we feel that they're fair, that we had a voice in creating them. And I think what we're hearing now, this great chorus of rules are bad, is because most of us feel so shut out, not that there's some natural aversion. And so I want to give you just a few examples that I think are so powerful. And many of you, I know, are aware of these. I just had there one. How many of you have heard of the B Corporation, for example? It is a new corporate form, thank you, a new corporate form, a legal form. It's now gone from just a couple states now, 7 or 8 states. It's a legal form where a corporation can, in its charter, commit not just to the benefit of its shareholders, but to the benefit of community and to employees and the environment. And so there were a few dozen, now there are a few hundred of these. So that is a set of rules that give us structure that make us feel good about those companies, and certainly that make them more sane too, because they don't have to violate themselves every day. So I want to point also to the fact that that about how rules can take hold and move very quickly if they make sense to us. And so I was so struck a few years ago by the plastic bag ban in San Francisco that immediately started keeping 5 million bags a month out of the waste stream. And so the supervisor who introduced that in San Francisco, he was quoted in the press as saying, yeah, we got calls from Paris and Belgium and New York City, you know, all these calls started coming in. He said, I think we started a wildfire of common sense. So I feel, again, that's what you all are doing. We're creating a wildfire of common sense. And one of my most personal connections to this wildfire is I'm very honored to serve on an international group called the World Future Council. It's based in Germany, people from all over the world, 50 of us. And one of the things we hit on, I'm sure you all know all about it, is the feed-in tariff, which term doesn't work in America. I call it the reward renewables law. It's a set of legal parameters that reward people in Germany in particular, where it really got going, reward people for installing and producing renewable energy. And guarantees they're going to be getting a return that will pay off their investment. And so, of course, householders have just gone on board, and 80% of the installations are households. And now, guess what? Germany, cloudy Germany, and maybe you already know this too, but I was really like jaw-dropping. Cloudy Germany in 2010 had almost half the production of solar in the world as a result of this. And Germany is on track now, within 8 years, to get 50% of its electricity from renewables. And so here's a rule, right? It's a standard saying if you participate, here's what you're going to get. So it's now, this legal framework is now gone to, I believe last count was 60 countries and states, and even in Jacksonville, Florida. So that's an example of what we're talking about. I also want to give an example from my home state of Texas, where because in the 1990s, the utilities, according to the inventor of this kind of group process, James Fishkin, the utilities brought together ordinary citizens to deliberate about what kind of energy they wanted. And that was one of the reasons that the standards, I love to use that word instead of regulations, the standards changed in Texas to encourage renewable energy. And soon, as you know now, Texas is a world leader in wind energy. So again, it's changing the rules. In that case, rules in part because citizens were consulted and said that they wanted, after hearing all the pros and cons of fossil fuel and renewables, even Texans were for renewable energy. I can say that because that's where I grew up, right? I also want to mention another example, because it's so dear to my heart and so powerful, is that India, which has huge governance problems, as we know, but they devolved the authority for rule setting to village task forces. And there are now 100,000 households involved in these all over India. And this is one of the reasons, I'm a little fuzzy here, it's either 100,000 households or 100,000 groups. Anyway, there's a lot, even for India. And as a result, the community group sets the rules for how to protect their forest, and they have to enforce these rules. And the scholar on this told me personally that it was where she found at least 2 women in leadership, it worked. And now India is one of the few countries in the world where forests are actually getting healthier, because massive engagement of people in their villages setting the rules and enforcing the rules. So I want then to move to the last of my thought traps, if you will, that I want to flip for us. And I think one of them is that there's really no time for this kind of touchy-feely democracy at a local level. We got to just impose everything. And I know you wouldn't say that, but some people feel that it's too late for anything that's really inclusive because it takes time. And so I just want to answer that by saying, by quoting Al Gore and who just said quite simply, to solve the environmental crisis, we've got to solve the democracy crisis. And I would argue, right, that the environmental crisis is the crisis of democracy in so many ways. And so here is what I'm suggesting, that we need to go beyond what we've inherited as this idea of democracy as something that's finished and formed that we were lucky enough, to just be born into. And actually, nobody told us that we need to create, every generation in some level needs to create democracy. It's not just something that we're born with if we're lucky. And it is not simply a structure of government. That with an ecological worldview, we can start thinking kind of like an ecology of democracy, not a set system, but a set of system values of inclusion, of fairness, of distribution of power that align with the rules of nature and with our nature. And because I want to capture that idea of an iterative, evolving democracy that is also connected to the earth, I call it living democracy. And because I think human beings can't create what we can't name, I'm encouraging us to name things, and I'll just throw that one out. It's living democracy because we have to live it, and it's a living process that we are engaged in. And since we now know that through conditions that bring out the best in us, if you like mine, the continuous dispersion of power, transparency, and mutual accountability, then we can begin to see that this is not just about government, although I'm going to come to that in a second, but it's also about democracy and economic life. And so then what happens, our eyes open and we say, oh, co-ops, those quaint things? No, hardly. Cooperatives, democratic forms of human economic organization, there are now, I've calculated conservatively, there are more people in the world who are members of co-ops than who own shares in publicly traded companies. And co-ops creating more jobs than publicly traded companies. And so we can look then, certainly at, I saw to my great pleasure, I saw the Organic Valley set up here, and know that Organic Valley is a great collaborator with you all in this fair. And I love to tell this, they've heard it too many times, I'm sure, at Organic Valley, but I met a handful of farmers back in Viroqua, Wisconsin in 1988, when so many, as you know, in the 80s, so many dairy farmers were going out of business. And they said, oh, we're going to start CROP, a dairy co-op, to help out our neighbors and help ourselves. And you know what I thought? I thought, that's nice. Of course I encouraged them, but basically my attitude was, that's nice, good luck, And I have to eat crow or whatever, as I just checked on the web that they now have, maybe that was 7 guys I was sitting with, 1,700 farms now. So that idea then that we can do democracy in economic life shows up also in energy. As many of you are aware of the history of the Danish wind industry that is now, leader in the world, that cooperatives back in the 90s were hugely important. Starting, there were over 2,000 wind co-ops. This started, Danish wind co-op started so that I'm sorry, my notes are a little unclear, but over an 8-year period, starting in the 90s, they had over 2,000 wind cooperatives. And by 2001, there were 100,000 families that belonged to wind-producing co-ops that were producing 86% of they were responsible for 86% of the wind turbines. The enormous amount of commitment that came because of the cooperative structure and households getting directly involved, not just as consumers, but as producers. And so we can reclaim this idea that democracy is just about politics. But in the political realm, we cannot give up on political democracy and say that because of that horrific Supreme Court decision, which I refuse to call by the name that you know it, not, because it's the opposite of that. I like to call it citizens defeated, but we aren't, because we've got, and there are ways, because the outrage is bipartisan. It's not just among progressives. The outrage is also shared by moderates and many Republicans. This cannot stand. And while we can't wait for a constitutional amendment, yes, we need different. Remember, it only took one vote. Only took 5 over 4 to pass that. And so it's going to be reconsidered, perhaps. We can keep that pressure on. And in the meantime, we can work for a kind of citizen financing. And I would encourage you, the campaign is just beginning, but look for a group called United Republic. Look for anything about voluntary public financing. There is a strategy afoot that would in some way build on what happened in Maine with public financing, so that my superhero, a waitress in the year 2000, because of public financing, she could run for office and be elected 4 times and help pass historic environmental legislation in that state requiring producer responsibility for electronic equipment recycling, even against all the pressure from corporations. So that's what can happen when citizens vote for people, elected them, who do not depend on corporate donations. And that's what no matter what it takes, we've got to establish that the idea that money is speech denies the core idea of democracy, that each of us has a voice, and that each of us needs to be heard, and that is not to be inundated by private wealth and shutting down our voices. Absolutely, we can do it. We can do this. So, now to the final part of my talk is the more personal talk. It's, what does this require of us? We are living in this extraordinary time. What do we need? And so I'm just telling you, speaking for me, what I'm working on. I'm working on it every day. And I've come to call it bold humility. And I'm going to start with the bold part first. I now see why it's so hard to be brave. Because we evolved in our wonderful social qualities, we evolved in these tightly knit tribes that I keep referring to. And what did we learn when we were in those tightly knit tribes? We learned that separating from the pack was scary. It could mean certain deaths if we weren't integrated in. So here we are. When the hyper tribe, I think of it as, I can almost see it, the hyper tribe heading over Victoria Falls, and I'm in the canoe, and what do? Do I jump out and try to swim to shore? Do I try to convince them, no, we're gotta go the other way? But in whatever thing I decide to do, if I'm with a group of people, America right now, and it seems like we're heading over the falls, then I have to separate from the dominant tribe. And that, no matter how you cut it, for most of us, I actually met one person recently who said he has no fear. Great. Not me. That idea of separating, even minimally things like challenging Oxford University Press, it like got my heart going. So my point is that we have to rethink fear. That's where the bold part is. And recognize that fear is not a verdict, that we're in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. In fact, it might be saying we are exactly where we need to be. We're just pushing our edge. And so I've developed some cheesy gimmicks to help me along. And I smile because I know my daughter would call it cheesy, but she's not here. So what I do regularly is I get these, when I get out on the edge and I know that I'm not saying something popular, I get pounding heart. And so I used to think, oh, you wimp, what's wrong with you? And now I say, oh, inner applause. And it works a lot of the time, not all the time, but that's okay, that's okay. We can live with it. So I'm learning that we don't have to get over fear. we don't have to, you know, we don't have to get over it. We can actually walk with it. We can take fear out of the closet. You know, it's okay to talk about stress or depression now, but how about we say we're afraid, and it's okay. It's okay. So we can walk with it. So here then is my point that fear is just another tool at our disposal. And now to the humility part. What am I getting at when I say bold humility? Well, I'm saying that one of the great things about getting old is I look back and I think, oh my goodness, the things that are most inspiring me today, like I just mentioned Organic Valley, you know, 20 years ago or less, I would have given them almost no chance of success. That is humbling. So, yeah, I mean, would I have predicted, take the fair trade movement 30 years ago, and this is this statistic I love, would I have predicted the fair trade movement, of which I think all of us feel in some way that we're trying to support and connected to? I never heard of it 30 years ago. Would I have predicted that now in the UK, and if you've ever been there, you know how much they love their pubs, that the UK, the fair trade sector, the ethical sector, this conscious shopping, is greater than all the sales of alcohol in the UK? Do I have to say more? So this, who would have thought? Brazil. If somebody had said to me 30 years ago that Brazil would be a leader in land reform and in agroecology, I would have said, are you crazy? Every attempt at reform had been met with death of peasants, with peasant blood. I couldn't predict that. And yet, Brazil now has perhaps the most, the biggest social movement in the hemisphere is a landless workers movement that has settled 250,000 families on over 20 million acres of land and has started the first organic seed line in that country and is now training people in a center that, guess what? Agroecology center that is on land that was once owned by Monsanto. Would I have ever predicted that? So all of this is kind of humbling. Or somebody had told me in Earth Day 1977 that Wangari Maathai was planting 7 trees that day to honor 7 environmentalists. And then her movement of the land, of the Greenbelt movement would grow to 45 million trees in Kenya over 2 decades. And then she'd get that call from the Nobel Committee that she'd won the Nobel Peace Prize. No. And then that standing gave Wangari Maathai, that standing gave her capacity to talk with the environmental program of the UN, and together they came up with Plant for the Planet. Have you ever heard of Plant for the Planet? Yeah, I only heard of it because it was on a poster in Leipzig High School in Germany. But little did we here know, but now this program has planted citizens registering with this program, citizens, governments, everybody registering with this over the world, planted 11 billion trees. Way beyond the target. And you know what country is planted the most trees? Ethiopia. And the president thanked the Boy Scouts for their contribution. So, this humility part is staying with that sense that, if you were wrong once, if I was wrong in being so skeptical once, then how can I say that anything is not possible now, right? So this is the theme then of my message, is that with an ecological worldview where we are all connected, think of that, and we are all, that change is the only constant, and that we are therefore co-creating our future together, then it is not possible to know what's possible. And we know how to build our courage. Because these mirror neurons, when somebody's observing you, think about the power that you have. When you are doing your thing, whether it's around renewable energy or some other great, all these different lessons here embodied under these tents, somebody is watching, multiple people are watching, and you never know then because they're actually experiencing something of what you're doing. So think of the ripples of and And as far as separating from the pack being so scary, well, obviously, we create new tribes. And that's also what we're doing. And I love this study from the University of Virginia, I think it was, where they put students at the foot of a hill, and they put heavy backpacks on them. And the only difference in two groups was one group had a friend by their side, and the other group was just standing with the heavy backpacks. And then they asked them to judge the steepness of the hill that they were about to climb. And I think you guessed it. The longer they had known the friend standing with them, the less daunting the hill appeared. So our friendships, the bonds that you're creating in an event like this, we are then creating what we do need as social creatures. That sense of, yes, we may be breaking with the dominant pack, but we are creating new tribes. We're not tribes of, just followers, but of co-creators. And that is one of the reasons that I think this is working. And we also then know, once we realize how we can, what the scientists now call neuroplasticity, which is a really hopeful breakthrough in understanding our brains, that the thoughts we put into our heads actually change the neural pathways physically in our brains. So if we're locked in the fear messages or in any way communicating them, then we are reinforcing that premise of lack. But as this glorious event embodies a sense of possibility, we are then repatterning those thoughts. So we actively then bring into our lives things like Yes Magazine, in which I'm associated, disclosure, and Solutions Magazine, which I'm also associated, disclosure. I mean, not that I'm paid by them, but I'm associated. So things like that, and into our inboxes every day. Emails like Your Olive Tree is one that I get, but email lists, and hopefully our newsletter will do that for you, of stories of possibility. That changes our neural pathways. So I'm suggesting then that we have tremendous power. That I started out with this theme of how this premise of lack leads to our feeling of powerlessness. And that is the only thing we have to worry about, because solutions are known, as I began this talk. And so I just want to stress to you that our power, what is it? And you've got plenty of it. Our power, I'm convinced, is ultimately who we are, who you are. And what is it? You have what everyone wants. That's enormous power. You have a sense of purpose. You have community. You have a sense of history that you are contributing to. That is incredible power. So I ask you to glory in it. And I will end with the words of a great poet, the late Denise Levertov, who captures the spirit of this gathering, I hope. It's called Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. We've only begun to envision how it could be to live as siblings with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We've only begun to know the power that is ours if we would join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. And I honor you, I honor you, I honor you. Thank you so much.